Coming up next, Book TV presents AfterWords, an hour-long program where we invite guest hosts to interview authors. This week, Pat Buchanan and his latest book, Suicide of a Superpower. In it, the former Nixon advisor argues that America is suffering from a moral and social collapse that may be permanent. He discusses his claims with Ralph Nader, consumer advocate and four-time presidential candidate.
Good day. Pat Buchanan today on his book, Suicide of a Superpower. Will America Survive to 2025? I'm going to give you a television eternity, Pat.
Right.
Take 3 minutes and explain your thesis, or theses. You actually have more than one.
Right.
And what would you do about them?
Well, one of them is I don't think the United States is going to be the last and lone superpower by 2020. I think China is rising so fast it's going to be a military virtual equal of the United States and an economic equal, so we're going to a bipolar world. Secondly, I think the American state, the nation's state, the government is in deep trouble, Ralph. It cannot balance its budgets or secure its borders or win its wars, or stop the hemorrhaging of its manufacturing base overseas. We lost 6 million manufacturing jobs in the first decade of the 21st century. Some 55,000 factories shut down. The United States is declining as a great superpower and a great nation. But I think the most important thing I see is that America is disintegrating. I think it was Lee Hamilton who said that the centrifugal forces are becoming dominant in American society. And I think if you look at our country, you will see that ethnically, in terms of class, in terms of philosophy and ideology, and in terms of race even, the United States seems to be breaking down into enclaves of people who separate from each other and do not much like each other and even detest each other. And so in that sense, America will be a legal entity, I think, and a political entity. But I don't think we'll be able to call ourselves one nation under God, indivisible. Again, I don't think we'll be a country in the sense that John Jay in Federalist II described us as one unique, separate people.
And yet, you know, this Occupy Wall Street effort that's
Right.
proliferating in hundreds of communities,
Right.
it's marked by a great diversity of background,
Right.
cultures, religions, race,
Right.
sort of united against the power of Wall Street and Washington.
Right.
In a desperate search for a more democratic society, not just political,
Right.
but economic. How do you explain that? That seems to be against the
Against what I'm saying?
force, yeah.
Well, I do think this. I think that the measure of unity that they have, I think one of the reasons they have it is because they're not defining their demands. I've seen some of their 13 demands, and I'm sure some of those folks who are Tea Party types would not be in favor of those demands. So I think there's no question about it, Ralph. I agree with the fundamental premise of the Occupy Wall Street folks, which is, look, these fellas up here played the highest stakes poker game in the world. They had a great time. They made billions of dollars. And then all of a sudden they were wiped out. And they ran to Uncle and said, give us back our chips. And Uncle gave them back his chips. Now they're playing again, and they got the bonuses. And everybody out in middle America is suffering. You got 9% unemployment and 16% probably active unemployed and those searching for work. And so I share the exasperation and the anger and the rage at that inequity and injustice. But again, when you come to an agenda, I think you will find they break down ideologically, and I think they will. And also, Ralph, I think as the winter comes, they're not going to, a lot of them are going to peel off. They're not going to get the publicity they did, Ralph. And what's going to happen, they're going to go and they're going to do things such as happened in Atlanta, happened in Oakland. And I think then the American people will turn them off, because the American people, they don't like what happened in Grant Park when I was out there in 1968.
Or they'll move south in warmer weather.
But listen, let me mention something. You and I were at the Battle of Seattle, all right?
Yeah.
We had a good group there. It was Ralph Nader, Pat Buchanan, Froze people, Jim Hoffa was there, Sweeney, all of us. And what happened? Remember the guys, at first it was the Sea Turtles, and secondly it was the guys throwing the cans through Starbucks, and the anarchists who basically turned the American people off to a movement I think the American people then would have supported. Stop exporting our jobs. Stop sending the factories overseas. Look out for our own people first.
It's interesting. That's why they're quite disciplined now in the Occupy Wall Street in terms of nonviolent civil disobedience. I mean, that Oakland conflict, for example, where the Iraq War veteran got hit by a canister. Even that didn't provoke it. They're really quite disciplined. Whereas they're not being infiltrated the way they were in Seattle. But you know, early in the Reagan administration, I was on a program with you and local DC TV, and my last words were, the coming months, Pat, will show whether you're a corporatist or a conservative. So let me ask you the question, just so people know where you're coming from. Are you a corporatist or a conservative?
I'm a conservative. I'm a traditionalist conservative, a Russell Kirk conservative. He was, you know, when I was younger, I didn't, you know, I followed the flashier conservatives and Russell Kirk. But eventually you came to see that really he had something really good to say about society and the good society and how to preserve it. So I'm much more that. I'm also, as a Catholic, I've got a little, you know, Rerum Novarum Quadragesimo Anno, the social encyclicals, back in there, Ralph, from my...
Liberation theology?
No. No. Let me tell you a story, though, Ralph. I went to school... And in journalism school, and one of my classmates was a Maryknoll priest. My brother was in the Maryknolls for a while, and a Maryknoll priest, and he and I became friends. His name was Miguel de Scoto. He became the foreign minister of the Sandinistas, and he won the Lenin Peace Prize. He's a classmate of mine, Catholic. So, no, but I did not agree with him back then, and I don't agree with him obviously now.
And how would you define a corporatist then?
I would say a corporatist, these fellas that are, a lot of the lobbyists here in Washington, D.C., some of them coming out of both administrations, both White Houses, they're down here in D.C., and they will do what the corporate boss tells them. Let me tell you a story again. You know, I came out of the Nixon White House, and there was an issue, and you probably were involved in it. Toshiba, this Japanese company, had taken this super quiet technology we had for our submarines where they could move even into Soviet ports and move back out undetected, and they had access to it, and they turned it over to the Soviet Union. And I thought the Congress ought to come down on them with both feet. And I found out that guys I'd worked with in the Nixon White House were representing Toshiba up there. And that's where that's the part in line for me.
Well, in the book, which I have read, the one thing that there was very little of was how in the mix of disintegration that you're describing is corporatism, is the power of corporations. Now, we know that corporations know few limits. Every major religion in the world warned its adherents not to give too much power to the mercantile class, the merchant class, the money lenders. And what we've seen in America, because you see a decline, I see a decline in this way. Parental authorities being sidestepped by corporations selling to kids junk food, violent programs, sadistic stuff.
Right. I agree with you 100%.
Right. And so let me, because I'm trying to get the variables in here. The military-industrial complex doesn't mind our empire abroad. That's more business. Eisenhower warned us about that. The corporations pushed NAFTA and WTO through. We were both opposed to it. That has dealt with a huge abandonment of jobs in industry to communist and fascist regimes overseas who know how to keep the workers in their place at 80 cents an hour. NAFTA dumped a lot of cheap corn into Mexico, dispossessed millions of families. Some of them in desperation went north over the border, increased the immigration there. You have the corruption of our democratic politics, you know, but with the big money in politics. And they want to own everything, even our genes. You know, they have thousands of patents of our genes. And they don't have any patriotism. I mean, these U.S. companies grew to profit on the backs of American workers. Got in trouble, they're bailed out by American taxpayers. Got in trouble overseas, American Marines, So what's their message to America? We're out of here with your jobs in industry to China. So why isn't and they've devastated the family. They have separated children from their parents. And we have a lot of documentation. How does this mix in the book, I mean, there isn't, except from one nice quote you have from a vice president of IBM on how industrial America is abandoning.
Well, okay. Well, let me just, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree with almost everything you said. Look, they have no value. I mean, look, when you put pornography on the internet for children and all the rest of it, whether it's Hollywood or the businesses, you're right. They're corrupt human beings that do that. And I'm against that. And you and I were opposed NAFTA and GATT and these other things. But I will say that, in only in partial defense of business guys, when I traveled the country in 92 and 96, I talked to textile guys. They say, Pat, I don't want to go overseas. The guy down the road went overseas. He's moved his factory to Mexico. This guy's moved to China. They're undercutting me. If I don't go move my factory, I'm finished. So I tell you who I blame is, frankly, the ideological free traders. I blame them, and I used to be one of them. Milton Friedman and I were friends until he wrote me a letter and said, you're doing the devil's work. I was opposed to free trade. So I agree with you on that. My only defense of some of these business guys is that they say, look, in the global economy, they dump me in. I work for this company, and I've got to save my company. But as someone has said, the problem, Ralph, is this, that the vital interests of the United States and the vital interests of the Fortune 500 or the 200 or whatever it is, they have used to be the same in this country. They've diverged. Their interests, and if what's good for General Motors is moving its factories overseas, then what's good for General Motors isn't good for the United States of America.
This is happening with our solar industry. Taxpayers funded solar R&D.
Right.
We were ahead of the rest of the world, and now the factories are moving to China.
Well, let me tell you,
because China is giving them the store.
But here, let me ask you what you think of the solution I propose. Again, I think the Republicans in the period from Lincoln through Coolidge, for example, you had all these patriotic American business guys who were rough customers. You had some robber barons in there. But what the Republicans did, they said, look, the taxes, this is the greatest market in the world, and these guys are going to pay an entrance fee, and it's called a tariff, and they had tariffs of 30 and 40%. Now, what I would do on manufacturers, all manufacturers coming to the United States, not just from China, I wouldn't single them out, I would put a 30 or say a 30% tariff. You got, let's say, $2.5 trillion in imports. You're just talking about $600 billion. Take that $600 billion and from those tariffs and eliminate taxation on manufacturers who start up or who produce in the United States. You tell the guys that build the Lexus, a beautiful car, and you guys, and you assemble it here. But what you're going to do, you're going to make your batteries here, your drivetrain, your tires, all those things here. You can bring your technology, you bring your money, and you can take your profits home. But you're going to have American workers build everything here, or otherwise you're going to pay a tariff on the stuff you bring in. I think it'd work like a charm. That's Hamilton.
Actually,
aren't you a Hamiltonian, Ralph?
Actually, some liberals favor a social tariff, which is when these products come from basically anti-competitive countries because they repress their labor.
Right. Well, my feeling, Ralph, on this is...
You'd have it across the board.
I would have it on manufactured goods, but the social tariff, problem with that is, and even the problem with the Congress up there saying, the Chinese, they're doing this with their... forget what the Chinese are doing. They're doing what's in their interest. And, I'd say the Chinese, we know what you're doing. And we can't control what you're doing, but we can control the products coming into this country.
On that point, to show you how you've changed, you basically have said in this book, we should have no conflict with China or Russia. We're actually disrespecting Russia because they've done everything since the collapse of the Soviet Union that we wanted.
Let me tell you,
and yet we have 12 aircraft carriers, which the Beltway guys are saying is needed to project American power. You know what the next country that has aircraft carriers? Italy has 2.
Well, and the Chinese have one they got a parts from the Russians, didn't they?
Yeah. So explain the Ukraine actually. Explain. I thought it was quite interesting the way you dealt very concisely with the way we're responding to Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union.
I think, look, Ronald Reagan is. He had a lot of luck. Yeah. But he was a good man, and I think in many ways a great president. And he began saying, look, this is an evil empire. They lie, cheat, and steal. When he said that in his first press conference, there were strokes all over at the Department of State. At the end of his administration, late 88 or early 89, he's walking through Red Square, arm in arm, with Gorbachev, and Russians are patting him on the back, okay? And the Cold War ended without a war.
Yeah.
And it was a bloodless victory. I said at the time, do not move NATO right up to Russia. They did everything we asked. They let the Germans go. They let Eastern Europe go. They took the Red Army, moved it back to the Urals. And what did we do? We took a military alliance.
And they broke up.
And then they let the whole place come apart.
Right.
And then and the Soviet Empire came down. And then we take and we moved the NATO alliance, which is designed to fight Russia in Europe, and moved it right up onto their front porch and almost in the house with the Baltic republics. I opposed that. I said it was a terrible mistake. And then we had some people go over there and they helped loot that place. I mean, help whatever it was loot the place. And that's why you got Putin now, who's a tough customer and a nationalist. And my view is Russia does not threaten the United States doesn't threaten their military. They don't threaten us. It's time for the Europeans to defend themselves. They're as rich as we are. They got as many people. And so that's what I would do.
Bring the soldiers back.
Well, I would bring what are we doing with the guys on the Elbe River as the Germans are going across waving to each other?
65 years after World War II.
And what is going on with all the, and I would say the same thing to the South Koreans. Yeah. Look, you know, when you were a kid and I was a kid, we knew a lot of guys, my older, you know, the guys that we grew up with were over there in Korea. But look, what are we doing with 16,000 or 28,000 folks in Korea? You tell the Koreans, you got an economy 40 times the size of North Korea, population twice as great. We're not going to leave our guys as hostages on the DMZ. We're bringing them home. You guys are the first responders in a war. Americans are not going to be the first to die in a second Korean War, period. The Japanese, look, at 65 years, get over it, you guys. You got 1% you spend on defense. You're going to have to spend more. And we got a lot of stuff here we can sell you. But you're going to be the first responders yourselves.
You can see now the drums are being beaten to raise China as a growing menace by the militarists and the Lockheed Martin types who want to sell. What's your take on China? Why in the book you say we have no conflict with China?
Well, no, but I'll tell you, I was against, and it was for economic and geostrategic reasons. I was opposed to bringing them. Well, I was opposed to the trip to China when Mr. Nixon was there. What we did. Then I didn't like what Carter did when he dumped Taiwan. And then I went into Reagan's White House. They called me in there and said this. What is it? They had a communique. It was a different than the Shanghai communique. And so I said, you know, I'm suspicious of China in terms of, I do believe the Chinese see themselves as replacing the United States. They're going to play the role in the 21st century that America played in the 20th century. I think they see that. And so I think we have been building them up. Where'd they get that $3 trillion, Ralph?
Yeah.
If they got in cash reserves.
Walmart.
So, but I'm more apprehensive of them. We don't want a war with them or a conflict with them. And I think the way Reagan managed the Cold War, but I do think the Chinese have ambitions. I mean, they've told us get out of the Taiwan Strait, get out of the South China Sea, get out of the East China Sea, and get out of the Yellow Sea. So, and these are our territorial waters.
Yeah, well, you know, they look at it this way. What if they had aircraft carriers off Long Island Sound?
Well, they had them in the Gulf of Mexico.
No, all that,
yeah. Well, I think, we'd be miffed.
Yeah. Let me go through some things in this book in more rapid fashion. Iran, you debunk Iran as a threat. Again, it's being built up as a major existential menace.
Well, I did say, sort of off the record to someone, that this plot to blow up the ambassador for Saudi Arabia, with this character down there who's a womanizer, a big drinker, a smoker, a loudmouth guy, who is a used car salesman, and they got him as the key guy in this conspiracy. So he goes to the Mexican cartel and happens to run into a DEA agent, and he did get some money from Iran. That's a little disturbing, but they sent it to the FBI account, apparently. So I said, this thing looks like it was worked up by a couple of interns at Langley. But it looks like a sting operation. Yeah. But you see the neocons. Yeah. This is active war.
Yeah.
Let's go after them. So I do think there's a real move in this country to have this country go to war against Iran, and I think that would be a terrible mistake. I agree. In this one, I agree with Brzezinski. Mm-hmm. And I heard him on MSNBC the other day. And frankly, I would be always, look, Richard Nixon engaged the Chinese. He engaged some real monsters. I mean, what Mao's the greatest mass murderer in history, exceeds Pol Pot. And we were over there, and I'm writing speeches, you know, toasting the health of Mao Zedong. And Nixon did that because you have to do those things. And we didn't attack China when they developed nuclear weapons. The Russians were the ones thinking of doing that. We didn't attack Russia. We didn't attack Pakistan or India. The Israelis got their nukes partly from the United States. So I think the United States should engage the Iranians to try to prevent them from going nuclear. I'm not sure they want to go nuclear. I don't think the American intelligence agencies have no firm data that they're going nuclear. And so I would engage them. I would have taken a look at that Turkish-Brazil proposal, you know. And also, look, they're not a threat to the United States of America. For heaven's sakes, we got thousands of nuclear weapons.
They haven't invaded anybody in 250 years.
Exactly.
But they have been invaded by Saddam with our backing.
With our support.
I mean, put the shoe on the other foot.
Yeah, well, I agree with you.
They're scared, though. They're scared of us.
Well, I think they are. Yeah. I believe they are, and I think they were very apprehensive when this story broke. I think that it was I bet they thought it was a pretext for the Americans to come after them.
Yeah.
But, you know, look, let's take the Israelis. They say, you know, this is an existential threat. The Israelis got hundreds of atomic bombs. Yeah. And who's the existential threat to whom? The Israelis are the ones that are running the planes out to, out to Gibraltar on test runs and running them into Greece. I mean, if I were the Iranians, and I would be looking very closely at that, quite frankly. And I don't know that the Iranians are going to do that. Suppose they did build a nuclear bomb. The Turks would build one, the Saudis would get one, and the Israelis would put their nuclear arsenal on a hair trigger. Yeah. What advantage do you get from doing that? Yeah. I mean, if I were an Iranian, I would say, I don't know what we get from this, fellas. We get maybe a year or two. We got a bomb longer than the Turks, but that's it.
They'd be, as you say, they would be annihilated.
Oh, and the Israelis would put their that nuclear force on a hair trigger.
Yeah. Now, you've come out for a Palestinian state long ago. I mean, you.
I was. Well, I can't. You know,
it's what. When you first said the Israeli lobby is powerful in Congress, like. Who's going to deny that, right? 400 and some automatic behind the resolution.
Right.
You know what's interesting? In 60-some years since Israel was created by the United Nations, there's never been a hearing where the Israeli peace advocates, who are now often foreign generals, foreign security people, members of Knesset, have never been invited to give the other side. And that a large number of Israelis support a peace resolution with a two-state solution.
Let me say this. I sometimes read Haaretz and the Israeli press, and you see these folks. There is far more dissent and argument and discussion in Israel over which course they should take, I think, than you find in the United States of America, quite candidly, you know.
Yeah.
So let me tell you why, but the Palestinians, I was really extremely strong. I went to Israel with Nixon right after the Six-Day War. I became militantly pro-Israel. In 73, I was down there in Key Biscayne. I was urging the president to go all out now when the Russians were moving their troops to airborne bases, moving ships through the Bosphorus, and guys said, look, we detected nuclear weapons on the ships. I thought we should have gone all out. What changed my mind is the simple thing is I'm a great believer in ethno-nationalism, as you know from the book. When the Palestinians rose up in the First Intifada and they stood up, I said the possibility, which I'd thought, of a single state is dead. I mean, these people want their own state. They may not have been a people in 73 when Golda Meir said the Palestinians are a people, but there comes a point where the people exist, a new people, and they became not just Arabs, but Palestinians. And once you do that, in this day and age, it has to be expressed in a nation state. And the best of the Israelis, like General Rabin, in my judgment, they came to recognize that, and they said, we got to deal with that. We got to work with this reality, because the greatest threat to Israel, as I write in this book, the existential threat is demography.
Yeah, more Arabs than...
Well, I mean, it's the numbers are growing enormously.
Let's turn to Mexico. On page 391, you had an amazing statement you can explain. Quote, you say, after all U.S. troops in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Korea are home, a U.S. Army will be on the Mexican border. For this is where the fate of the Republic will be decided, end quote. Can you explain that?
Sure. By 2050, the number of Hispanics in the United States, if we do nothing about immigration or illegal immigration, will be 135 million. And they'll be largely concentrated in Southern California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. If that happens, I think culturally and socially, the American Southwest is as much a part of Mexico as it is of the United States. I think we then become a binational state and a bilingual nation and a binational nation. And I don't think the United States survives. You see what happens in places like Kosovo when they do that way, they pull away. And so the question, this is what might be called the national question. I mean, Mexican folks are good folks, are hardworking folks, and even the illegals who come here work hard. But we're going to have to decide, are we going to remain one nation and one people? And I think if we do not get control of immigration, certainly illegally, and even legally, if we continue with 1 million and 1.5 million, when the melting pot, Ralph, has been rejected and broken, and we're talking multiculturalism, which is failing all over Europe, I think that's one of the fundamental problems I see, which is the internal breakup of the United States into its component parts.
See, what I think, you go further in that, though. You quote some high Mexican officials that seem to think that the Southwest of the United States is going to be theirs.
Let me say...
You think there's a reversal movement underway there?
I think...
You weren't for the Mexican-American War, were you? Lincoln despised it.
Yeah, well, Lincoln lost his, was thrown out of Congress after one term, yeah. But, didn't he say secession was justified in Lincoln in 1847, 48? He was very much against it. Yeah. He had the spot resolution, show me the spot where the Mexicans came in here and shot the American troops at patrol. And he was very much against it, you're right. But he found out he could use, he didn't give back the Southwest, did he, when he got in power?
No. What's your view on the Mexican-American War as a segue to this discussion?
I think in a way, I think it was a just war in this sense. I think the Texas War of Rebellion and Revolution was a just war. These people rose up, and they outnumbered the Mexicans 10-1. The Mexicans had invited them in, and they took they took Texas out, and for 10 years the Mexicans didn't try to retrieve it, and they were an independent country, and then they said, we want to join the United States. I think they had a sovereign right to do it. There was a dispute all the way down to between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River, and so Polk sent the troops down to the Rio Grande, and he said, we claim it all.
But they want to expand the territory for slavery. That was one of the incentives.
Well, you're right. People. Yeah. That's what I point out in there. Anybody thinks this is a democratic revolution. Texas was a slave state as soon as it came, a slave nation. Yeah. But I do think that the Americans were right in this sense that they had a legitimate claim there, and the Mexican army came right up to the border, and you had to fight. But there's no doubt once the war started, Polk said, okay. And he sent, who's that, Trist down. Was it Trist he sent to Mexico? Yeah. The greatest State Department agent ever, who took the entire Southwestern California.
Before we take a break, do you think that the Mexican nationalism really has designs on...
I believe that the Mexicans, something like 56% of the Mexicans, I'm not sure I got the figure in this book, I've got it in earlier ones, believe that the Southwest by all rights belongs to them. I think they believe that as they move in, gradually the numbers, they will gradually become, as I said, socially and culturally a part of the Southwest. And some of them quite candidly believe that if, with the merger of the three nations in this, that president, that it will be as much a part of Mexico as of the United States. But I think they want to be associated with us much more economically, too, because they get the benefits and the rest of it. Yeah, look, I don't think they're all benign in their purposes down there in Mexico City.
Okay, we'll be back after the break.
On the go, AfterWords is available via podcast through iTunes and XML. Visit booktv.org and click Podcasts on the upper left side of the page. Select which podcast you'd like to download and listen to AfterWords while you travel.
Pat, you make some pretty incendiary statements in the book, and I want to go through them and put them in a larger context, because you're half Scotch-Irish and half your ancestors and half German, I understand.
And we're one half German, 1/4 Scotch-Irish, 1/4 regular Irish.
So when the Irish poured into the United States after the potato famine, the reaction to them was unbelievably vicious. They were called hooligans, lazy drunkards, polluting the race, etc.
Hooligans might have been not altogether wrong.
Yeah. And then, of course, see how they were treated in the Civil War riots in New York City.
Right.
So, and they were called criminals and shiftless and so forth. So, and now, when you talk about New York City, that the vast majority of street crimes are black and Hispanic.
Right.
Let me ask you this question. Don't you think the vast majority of corporate crimes are white?
Yeah.
Okay. So you left that out. See, if you were strengthening your argument, because there's a lot of preventable violence and occupational disease and hospital infections and...
All right, but let me tell you what look, I think corporate criminals ought to go to prison, but the point I was making is that one of the points I was making is, there's real objection. I know a lot of African-American guys say the cabs go right by.
No, I know you make that point.
Yeah, but so 98%, according to the guy that runs the cabs, who's a Hispanic, African-American combined, he said 98% of the assaults and murders of cab drivers are done by black and brown folks.
Yeah.
All right? So if it's 49-1, that if you get mugged or killed, it's going to be by a person of color, that would explain why a cab driver might say, let's pass by the person of color and pick up the corporate crook, because the corporate crook isn't going to beat me to death in the car.
Well, as you know, a lot of the crime is based on the drugs and the war on drugs, which has been attacked by both right and left, including Milton Friedman.
I've got Milton Friedman in there.
And a lot of discriminatory enforcement. For example, there have been studies showing that black teenager, white teenager, same record, caught with drugs, 5 times more likely the black teenager goes to jail. But aside from the way the statistics reflect these kinds of distortions, do you think the high percentage of crime by blacks and Hispanics, street crime, not corporate crime, reflects something inherent in their character, or do you think it reflects a class deprivation? Is it race or is it class deprivation? That's why I went back to the Irish example.
Well, I think this. I grew up in Washington, D.C. We had 400,000 black folks, 400,000 white folks. You didn't have crime in those days in either community like the crime you've got today.
Right.
I think one of the main problems is the total collapse and decomposition of the African-American family. You've got kids born now, 71% of African-American kids are born to single moms, some of them high school dropout gals. And so they got no father at home. And frankly, going back to one of your earlier points, the welfare state has taken the place of the father in the home, and all those welfare benefits and programs and the rest of it have not prevented the decomposition of the family. I think they may have contributed to it. And so I think it is certainly a matter of the social situation in which these kids live. It's a matter also of the decline of religion. I've got 2 chapters in there. People, they've got no internal resistance or opposition to things like that.
Yeah, but so, let me just point out.
Right.
So if all these people had jobs and the public works were decent, and there weren't rats and tenements and landlord abuses and drug wars, etc., you would say that crime level would go down.
Oh, listen, the crime level was...
So
people were poor in the Listen, Ralph, 1930s in this town, they're a lot poorer than they sure are today, where they got the highest... D.C.'s got the highest per capita income, I think, in the nation.
And most of the...
And they were poorer in 1950, and you didn't have the crime today. I mean, let me ask you, what explains it? What explains the explosion of crime, quintupling of the prison population? Of course, one reason you're right is drugs. It ain't alcohol, which it was with the Irish. It's drugs, which in some cases are far, far worse. And so that's why I'm in favor of prohibition of drugs, where I wouldn't be in favor of prohibition of alcohol.
Well, in other words, you would attribute it more to class than anything inherent, right?
I would attribute it more to the collapse of the family and the collapse of religion and things like that. Yes.
They all go together, the thing that you have to be worried about this book is they're going to want to taint you as bigoted and racist, right?
Tell me about it, Ralph.
But there are 2 parts.
Right.
There are 2 sections in there that are semi-tragic and semi-humorous that I want to bring your attention.
Right.
In your zeal to cover all ethnic groups, you alight on the poor Iroquois in upstate New York, the soccer team.
Well,
and you said you're trying to show how the ethnic priority is over the American priority.
Exactly.
So they wanted to go to England to compete in the soccer match, and they wanted to go on an Iroquois passport, and Britain said no, and Hillary
said yes,
and then they decided not to go. Well, as you know, first Native Americans have certain modest levels of sovereignty based on treaties.
Right.
They're not like any other immigrant group.
Right.
And you complete your little paragraph here by saying, for the Iroquois, being Iroquois is first, and American is next.
Yeah.
Give them a break.
Well, no, look, if you're asking yourself, if you're looking for an Iroquois passport, I would say you consider yourself an Iroquois first. Is that outrageous? I mean, what is wrong with saying that?
No, but you were criticizing them for being Iroquois first.
I'm not criticizing them. I mean, here's the thing. I mean, in a way, I'm saying this shows you, Ralph, in a very small way, the force that Pat Moynihan and Arthur Schlesinger said are the dominant forces right now in the world in ethnic nationalism, tribalism, religious fundamentalism are far more powerful than ideology. And we're not immune in this country from these forces. And when the melting pot has been thrown out and you're preaching multiculturalism, what holds us together?
Let me tell you what. Corporate commercial culture is transcending ethnic differences. In other words, if you want to sort of meld people together, even though you may not like the values, corporate commercial culture is sweeping the world. The same people in Sri Lanka are listening to the same music and going into the same McDonald's as they are in Alaska.
Okay.
And so you don't take that into consideration.
You're talking economics. There's no question.
But it's a culture, too.
It is a culture. But let me tell you, it is not as powerful as these forces I'm describing. Take a look at what's tearing countries apart.
Well, let's talk about America.
Well, what's tearing apart?
It's overwhelmingly a unifying force for whatever insidious reasons.
Well, let me tell you, there are unifying forces I didn't cover in the book. One of them is sports. ESPN, it's a religion. It's Sunday, all day Sunday.
Corporate commercial culture.
The NFL,
exactly.
Right. And there's no doubt in all that. The economics is one thing that does unite folks in sports, but what I'm saying is these forces pulling worlds and continents and countries apart. Barack Obama said it himself in his Nobel Prize thing. He says, the wars today are not between nations, they are within nations.
Yeah, but in the United States, the corporate commercial culture, as you say, they make icons out of minorities, sports, music, actors, actresses. That is a dynamic. I'm not going to convince you.
But that's free enterprise.
Yeah,
but what are you going to do?
But the point is, it's reducing these ethno-clashes that you think are disintegrating America.
Listen, there's no doubt people have in common Mazda Gallery. Let's go out there. We're all shoppers.
That's right.
That's what unites us. We shop together.
That's what Bush after 9/11 said, shut up and shop. He said the American culture. Now, here's another one. This one, I know a little bit about this. Black farmers. Black farmers, very hardworking. After the Civil War, they had a few million acres, and it started declining after World War I. And because of the most odious discrimination on support structures favoring white farmers and not black farmers by the Department of Agriculture. I mean, it was so crude, and it was done by the county agents who were whites, and a lot of them were racist.
They're all appointed.
Right. And you were upset because after years and years of litigation delay, and a lot of these farmers in their 80s and 90s, if they hadn't passed out, got $50,000. And the point is that they were dispossessed of their land. They were forced.
These individuals, or did they all prove they were dispossessed of their land?
Wait, they were dispossessed, and they had to sell out. And so now you're down to a few tens of thousands of acres of black farmers. And, of course, the records disappeared. They didn't exist.
So everybody gets 50 grand?
Well, no, but they knew from the land records.
All right, didn't we have...
This one, in your next edition,
right.
you really have to.
All right, well, all right, then they got the Hispanic farmers, didn't they?
Yeah, the same thing.
They got $1 billion or something,
peanuts,
and they went down.
But peanuts compared to 50 years of discrimination.
They went down to Florida. Are there any Hispanic farmers who didn't get, got robbed or something like that? They couldn't get any. They're going to give out $1 billion.
But it comes from the Department of Agriculture county agents discrimination.
But
That's
look,
the root
we had all that many Hispanic farmers.
In the Southwest, there were. Yeah, this was heavily in the Southwest.
But they couldn't. They went to Florida. They couldn't find any.
Yeah, but mostly, I mean, when you consider what is at stake over 50, 60 years, do the arithmetic. Anyway, I don't want to belabor it, but I do want to point it out.
Okay.
Now, you talk about decline.
I gather that set you off in the book. Stop
did it ever?
Right.
Decline of Catholicism,
right.
The Catholic Church, decline of Christianity makes up a lot of this.
It's two chapters, right?
Now, here's what I understand, because it's not all consistent. Like, let's take, for example, the situation of Bethlehem in the West Bank.
Right.
Okay. It's now surrounded by 10 growing Israeli colonies, which block access to Jerusalem.
Right.
And there are 2 other colonies that block access people to Hebron. Okay. There are very few Christians left.
I know it.
The Church of the Nativity is almost like isolated.
Right.
The stores, Christian stores for the tourists and hotels are shut down. So the pilgrims who come from all over the world can't stay overnight anymore in Bethlehem. Okay. Now the Presbyterian Church has taken a stand.
Right.
The Methodist Church has taken a stand. The evangelicals support Israel no matter what happens against the birthplace of Jesus Christ. You think they would have an exception, but the Vatican, and you know this probably better than I, because Robert Novak wrote 2 columns on it. The Vatican's very upset. They're negotiating with Israelis all the time, access to holy places and so on. But they haven't really spoken out. Now, the Israelis blasted their way to protect the Wailing Wall in 1967.
All right.
And where is Christendom here? Where is Christendom on these holy places? And what about the U.S. Congress? What about the Catholics and Protestants in the U.S. Congress? This has nothing to do with, whether Israel is going to get $3-4 billion more of aid every year.
Well, I take your point. Robert Novak was a good friend of mine. He told me I've got to go back over there. I haven't been over in the West Bank since '84. Who was the mayor then? He was a wonderful fellow. He was a Christian over there for a number of years, and Bob's good friend of Bob Strauss. Look, I don't agree.
But see, where is the religious nationalism there? What I'm saying
where's the moral authority of the Catholic Church there? I don't disagree with you, Ralph. I think they ought to stand up, frankly, for the Palestinian Christians. Ralph, look at all the Christians. There's 17 million Christians in that part of the world. I will say this. They're not being, if it's in Israel, they're not being persecuted there like the Copts are in Egypt, or the Assyrian Catholics and the Chaldeans are in Iraq, or they're victims of pogroms. They're victims of persecution, martyrdom. I mean, in Afghanistan, liberated Afghanistan, one guy converted to Christianity, and they sentenced him to death.
See, the demons have been released because for centuries, the whole Arab Islamic world was a paragon of tolerance for religious sects.
Under the Ottoman Empire?
Ottoman Empire, under the Abbasids, under the Umayyads. I mean, they prided themselves on it.
Right.
You see? But then when the West moved in, divide and rule, you support one Muslim sect against another, they engage in a fury, then they turn on other
You got a problem
minorities.
with the British Empire, Ralph?
Yeah, a little bit. So, you see, this is what happens.
Well, I don't disagree with that.
Invaders disintegrate society.
But let's say, there's no doubt that that's one of the great causes, but let's say this. Right now, you do have a rising Islamic movement there, and a lot of them, I don't disagree with the fact that people's religion should not only shape their culture, but they want it represented. Christians wanted that in the United States in the 19th century, a more Christian society reflecting our views and values. But also, Ralph, I mean, this thing, what's taken place against the Christians over there, and some governments are trying to stop it, but that is real. It is an effort really to drive Christianity completely out of that part of the world, all the way from Egypt over to Pakistan and India. And all those in there are facts. And how, I mean, it's down into Ethiopia. There's that, what's it, the 16th parallel south of there. It's heavily Catholic, the sub-Saharan Africa. And north of that, in the Sudan and places like that, it's Arab and Muslim. Look at their, I mean, the persecutions are unbelievable.
Yeah, but you see, they're all over. Look at the Chinese are persecuting Muslims in Western China.
The Uyghurs, right?
Yeah, right. But take Syria, for example. Very peaceful Christian community.
Right, let me ask you about
very
that.
Very peaceful, and they're terrified.
Well, you're terrified.
If this disintegrates, that they're going to be slaughtered or exiled.
Well, see, look, the Christians are very successful. Well, the Christians are very successful in Syria, and they're protected by Hafiz al-Assad and his son both. And they stay. I heard the motto over there is, when Assad goes, it's the Christians to Beirut and the Alawites to the wall. I mean, so I'm not sure this is all that liberal a society that's going to emerge out of any of these places. But clearly, one of the factors, Ralph, is this rising militancy of Islam. I think they're looking at, let me say this, I think they're looking at Europe as a decadent and dying continent, and they're exactly right. And the Europeans can't provide enough service workers to take care of their aging, shrinking, dying populations. And I think the folks are going to be moving across the Mediterranean into Europe. And
it's a huge backlash against colonialism and invasion and invaders. And look at now, Iraq, Afghanistan. You don't think the U.S. military is going to defeat the Taliban?
No, I think it's going to end very badly. I think the Taliban will be coming back to power.
In fact, General McChrystal is quoted in your book as saying they fought us to a draw. 30,000 people in sandals, Kalashnikovs, and rocket-propelled grenades.
You know, look, it's the colonists. The colonists took care of the Brits, and the Brits were the greatest empire on earth.
It's very hard to defeat any resistance movement against foreign invaders.
Sure, I mean they live there, and they're going to stay there, right?
Okay, now. Sometimes when I read this book, as I was reading this book, there's almost a weeping, wistful quality to it. It's almost like, if I can use this analogy, you're in a neighborhood and you have, say, one ethnic group,
right?
Say white Anglos and with some Irish sprinkled in. And they've lived there for years.
Right.
Suddenly, people come in of other ethnicities, other religions. The food smells different. The kids are running over the grass. And it's like the whole breakdown of this kind of quiet, self-contained community. Because
let me
finish.
Sure.
Because what gets me about what you're trying to convey here is that you're not taking account, except in the last part of the book where you become optimistic. You're not taking account the common desires for fairness, fair play, decent standard of living, even tolerance that cross all ethnicities, other than they're extremists, right? But we're talking about the large majority. Here's what you say on page 364, because I saw you zigging and zagging here, partly because you didn't want to be misunderstood. You say, quote, on the national question, Americans are united. There still exists in their hearts the will to remain one nation under God and one people united by history, heritage, and language, committed to proposition that in America men and women are to be judged, not, quote, not by their color, the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That's out of Martin Luther King, unquote. Americans still believe that we are all equal in rights, not because of where we came from, but because of who we are, Americans. Okay. So why do you go overboard with this who's white and who's not white? Do you think Hispanics are not white? Do you think Justice Sotomayor is not white? She looks white to me.
Well, I think she's a Puerto Rican lady.
Yeah, but
I don't know how she defines herself. Yeah. But let me tell you what I see as the problem. There's no doubt, as I've said many times before, anybody can be a good American. I think any group can be assimilated, but there's three problems, Ralph. One is the enormous numbers of people coming into this country who have never before been assimilated into any Western country. Never happened.
Well, that was 2 years ago.
Yeah, but
1912, the highest level of
immigration.
Okay,
but now we get to the second thing.
Okay.
The process of assimilation, the melting pot, the public schools, the parochial schools, the fact that we listened to the same radio, went to the same TV, rooted for the same teams, all these things, the melting pot has been rejected for multiculturalism. People are told, keep your own faith, keep your own traditions, don't assimilate, be different, etc.
They do
Multicultural.
They do that for protective reasons.
Okay, they do it for protective reasons. And the third thing is, I look around the world, and you see these. You look at, say, just take Iraq as one. The Sunni versus the Shia, the Christian versus the Muslims, the Kurds versus the Arabs. They're all coming apart. The Uyghurs versus the Chinese in China. Take a look at Burma. People don't know it. 40% of these tribes are trying to break away. All of these powerful forces, even in Europe, Scotland wants to break away. Catalonia wants to break away. Northern Italy, the Lega Nord. And so what I'm saying is, we've thrown out the melting pot. We bring in all these folks from all these places, never assimilated. We destroyed our process of assimilation. And I'm looking around the world and seeing it's all coming apart. And I'm saying, why are we taking this risk with the greatest country on earth? Why are we doing it?
But you all say, you say, how can multiculturalism and multi-ethnicity and all that, how can that produce a better country than the one we grew up in, mainly, say, our generation?
Right.
Okay, well, let me give you an example. I mean, first of all, it wasn't all that great, There were, segregation was horrible. The repression of human potential among blacks was terrible. There was a lot of discrimination against women. Now, in my Harvard Law School class of I entered in 1955.
Right.
We had 560 students, 560 students. We had 13 women. Women were never allowed at Harvard Law School until 1950.
Right.
We had 13 out of 560 women, maybe 2 blacks, and I don't think 1 Hispanic. The Hispanics at Harvard were usually children of South American dictators.
Right. Well, it's at Georgetown we had the rich kids. Right.
Now, was that a good thing when you wistfully go back?
Well, no. Let me say this.
Grew up in?
No, the point I would say, what I would say here is, look, all these kids, were they raised up in a tradition to be American? And when they went into law school with you, at what law school was it?
Harvard.
Okay, you're in Harvard Law. You're in the top law school. Yeah. All right, were kids kept out of there because if they were kept out who are qualified and unqualified guys got in, that's wrong. What's happening now, as I write in there, you read in there, white working class kids are the conservative, and Christian kids are the most discriminated kids in these Ivy League schools, according to that study I quote in there. That's what I don't like. What I like is look, it doesn't bother me that in the NFL, African Americans are overrepresented by 500%. Why? They got every job they got because of ability, drive, energy, and the rest of it. That's the 1950s I remember. Okay. And those are the.
But you wouldn't think this is a nice thing.
Well, if they're discriminated, look, if they're discriminated against, if they were discriminated against, but I mean, if they got better scores than Ralph Nader, Ralph shouldn't have been in there.
But you see, Pat, here's the point. You give too much credence. You got to look into the SAT nonsense. It's a terrible way to screen out or screen in people. Well, but it's heavily correlated with family income. Overwhelmingly correlated with family income.
Well, let me ask you that.
Far better are the assessment tests.
Well, let me ask you that.
Yeah. Okay, not A, B, C, D, none of the above. No. Do you know this about economics? Do you know this about history? The assessment test. Harvard and all the Ivy League, they use these multiple choice, which correlated with family income. And
maybe family income.
Yeah.
Well, when I was growing up, a lot of the guys, they were very wealthy with family income. Maybe they got rich by some scheme or something, but most of them, these lawyers and doctors and people were very smart people, and that's why they made more money.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I want to go on to one other thing here, because I think you're overestimating the clashes. I think corporate commercial culture is pervasive. I think a lot of people...
You think it can hold us together?
I think a lot of people have come over here who have assimilated. Look at the sub-Indian continent in California.
Well, yeah, but look, you got
Silicon Valley.
Well, you got extremely bright kids, and they're in school, and they're winning all those spelling bees and things like that.
Now, where you have 60% of the population recently from, say, South America, they're going to create their own subculture. You're right, like South Florida. They're going to create their own subculture. But you remember Poletown, that battle with GM in Detroit? It was the early 80s. It was a 5,000 people community on one side of Detroit. And GM said, we want to build a Cadillac plant.
Right.
And we would like it here. It was 450 acres.
Right.
Okay. The black mayor, Mayor Coleman, went along with it. So you had a white corporation, black mayor, went along with it. So did the UAW.
Right.
The only problem was there were 1,000 homes. there was 400 small businesses. There were 12 churches, including a beautiful Polish-built Catholic church, a hospital, and 2 schools. Right?
That sounds like
they took up by eminent domain.
Eminent domain for a
absolutely for a plant.
Well, I don't believe in that.
Completely leveled it.
I don't believe in that.
They ended up producing about half the jobs they promised.
Right.
And the church, because we had people out there trying to save it, John Richard and others, the church was bulldozed immediately at 5 o'clock. The police came. They cleared out the parishioners and the priest. They bulldozed this beautiful church that early Polish immigrants built. Right. You know where that church was? It was where the shrubbery of the parking lot of the General Motors plant was.
Well, look, I don't believe in that. I forget the Supreme Court decision.
No, but here's the point.
Right.
That community was half black and half Polish and Eastern European, living in very small but clean, prepared houses, little flowers and gardens. You know, the old scene.
Sure.
Peacefully.
Sure. I grew up in a community.
But who disintegrated it?
Well,
see, I'm trying to point out.
I'll tell you who disintegrated. The politicians did if they granted. How can you grant General Motors the right to tear down private homes? Eminent domain is, you've got the interstate highway system. Sometimes you can take lands for public purposes, but this seems to be a private purpose that the mayor went along with. I would agree with you 100%
Upheld by the Michigan Supreme Court and recently in the New London case.
Well, let's see. Okay, I agree with you on that New London decision.
So I'm trying to show that corporate power disintegrates community.
Oh, listen, I know it. I mean, I know it does.
And here, listen, we don't have much more time, but I do want to ask you, when you said religion, race, culture, and tribe are the four horsemen of the coming apocalypse. Would you add corporatism to that?
There's only 4, Ralph.
Okay, would you say there are 5?
No, I'll tell you.
Would you say that corporatism is part of that?
I think, corporatism is, what it has become. I'll tell you what, take religion and ethics. Look, religion is the basis of ethics and morality. And when that goes, then I think, and you've got powerful corporations, they're a lot more, even more dangerous in many ways than individuals, no doubt about it. And do I believe in rampant corporatism? No, I don't worship. I mean, I do agree. I don't agree with the Pope on his world. What he's got, a World Bank? World Economic, like the Fed. I don't agree with him on that. But when he did say the worship of capitalism is idolatry, I do agree with that. I believe in free enterprise, the free enterprise system. And I think it's the greatest in the world. But I do think when corporations get that powerful, they do have to be regulated. And I don't agree with what happened to Poletown.
Well, we're out of time, unfortunately, thanks to C-SPAN. We had a discussion that wasn't made up of sound bites, right?
Right, I think so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ralph. We got to get back, need a second Battle of Seattle.
That's right.